The first time Pauline Holloway noticed Owen Finley sitting beside her at the town gathering, she thought nothing of it, because the bench was long and the church hall was crowded and people in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878 did not think too hard about where a man chose to rest his boots. The second time, she told herself it was coincidence. The third time, she began to wonder. By the sixth gathering of that same year, she had stopped wondering and started watching. The way a woman watches something she does not yet understand but knows, somewhere deep in the part of her that trusts instinct over reason, that it means something. Owen Finley was not a man who drew attention to himself. He was not the loudest voice in the saloon, or the fastest draw on the street, or the man who tipped his hat to every woman just to see which one smiled back. He was tall in a quiet way, broad-shouldered in a way that looked like work rather than show, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges when the humidity rose off the creek in the summer, and gray eyes the color of the sky just before a good rain. He ran a cattle ranch 4 miles north of town, the Finley spread that his father had built and left to him when consumption took the old man in the winter of 1874. Owen had been 23 then. He was 27 now, and he ran the ranch with 2 hired hands and a stubbornness that people in Caldwell Creek either admired or found mildly exhausting, depending on the day. Pauline Holloway was 24 years old, and she ran the town's only schoolhouse with a precision and warmth that made parents trust her and children love her in equal measure. She had come to Caldwell Creek 3 years earlier from Wichita, where she had trained under the town's head teacher, before being recommended for the position in this smaller, newer settlement, still finding its feet on the Kansas plains. She had brown hair that she kept pinned back during school hours and let loose on Sunday evenings, and green eyes that people described as serious until she laughed, at which point they described them as entirely something else. She lived in a small house attached to the back of the schoolhouse, a house with 2 rooms and a porch that faced west so she could watch the sunsets, which were, in her private opinion, the most reliably beautiful thing about the frontier. She had not come west looking for love. She had come west looking for purpose, and she had found it in 31 children of varying ages, and the satisfaction of watching a child's face change the moment a difficult idea became clear to them. Love, she had decided, was something that happened to other people, or perhaps to her in a future she could not yet see from where she was standing. What she had not counted on was Owen Finley, and his inexplicable tendency to sit beside her at every single town gathering without explanation or apology. Caldwell Creek held its town gatherings in the church hall on the first Saturday of each month from April through November, when the weather allowed people to travel in from their farms and homesteads. They were part civic meeting, part social occasion, and entirely essential to the community's sense of itself. The Reverend opened the proceedings with a brief prayer. The mayor spoke about town business. Neighbors argued about water rights and road conditions with the passionate investment of people who had built something from nothing and were determined to protect it. And then, once the formal matters were concluded, the tables came out, and there was food and music, and the specific kind of laughter that comes from people who have survived hard seasons together. At the April gathering, Owen had sat down beside her with a simple nod and said nothing further. Pauline had nodded back and turned her attention to the Reverend, who was speaking about the need for a new roof on the church before winter. At the May gathering, the same thing. He arrived, found the bench where she was sitting, settled in beside her with that same quiet nod, and directed his attention forward. He applauded when appropriate. He voted when votes were called. He left when it was over, touching the brim of his hat in her direction on his way out. By July, Pauline had mentioned it once to her friend Clara Marsh, who ran the general store with her husband Ned, and had the particular gift of knowing everyone's business without ever appearing to pry. Owen Finley, Clara had repeated, in a tone that suggested the name meant something to her. He sits beside me every single time, Pauline said. Not in the same seat because the seating changes every month, but wherever I sit, he finds the spot beside me. Clara had looked at her with the patient expression of someone waiting for a slower traveler to catch up. And this troubles you? It puzzles me, Pauline said. He never speaks, he just sits there. Perhaps, Clara said carefully, he simply wants to be near you. Then he ought to say so, Pauline said, and Clara had smiled in a way that Pauline found slightly irritating. The August gathering brought a matter of real urgency to the floor. 3 homesteading families on the south side of the creek had seen their water supply fouled by a mining operation that had started upstream earlier that summer, operated by a company out of Topeka that had the legal paperwork, but apparently not the decency to consider what their runoff would do to the people downstream. The gathering turned heated. Men raised their voices. Ned Marsh stood up and made an argument that was logical and precise, and entirely failed to move the company's local representative, a man named Cutter who had the expression of someone who had heard similar arguments many times before, and found them personally inconvenient but legally irrelevant. Pauline found herself standing before she had quite decided to, and she spoke for 4 minutes about the children in her classroom who were coming to school with stomach ailments from the contaminated water, and about the fact that the legal paperwork might protect the company's right to operate, but could not protect them from the moral weight of what they were doing. She spoke clearly and without raising her voice, and when she sat back down the hall was very quiet. Owen Finley beside her said in a voice low enough for only her to hear, "That was well said." She turned to look at him. He was looking forward, his jaw set, his hands resting on his knees. It was the most he had spoken to her in 5 months of sitting beside her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. The meeting resumed. The matter of the water contamination was not resolved that evening, but the company's representative looked considerably less comfortable leaving the hall than he had looked entering it. And 3 weeks later, a Topeka newspaper ran a story about the situation that Pauline suspected had more to do with the ongoing pressure from the families involved than with her 4 minutes of speaking. The company eventually redirected their runoff through a series of channels that kept it clear of the residential water supply. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a real one, and the families on the South Bank were grateful. September came. The gathering on the first Saturday was dedicated largely to planning the harvest celebration that Caldwell Creek held each October, a tradition that had begun 5 years earlier when the town had survived its first genuinely brutal winter, and the settlers had decided that surviving together was worth marking together. There were to be food stalls and a fiddler, and, weather permitting, dancing on the flat ground behind the church hall. Volunteers were needed for various tasks. Pauline sat in her usual spot, 3rd bench from the front on the left side, and within 5 minutes of her arrival Owen Finley was beside her. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he settled in, his hat held in his hands, the way men in church held their hats, as though it gave them something to do with their hands. He was listening to the mayor outline the arrangements for the celebration with the same calm attention he gave everything, and he volunteered, when asked, to contribute 2 steers from his ranch for the communal roast. After the formal portion of the meeting, when people began to cluster into smaller conversations, and the church ladies began setting out the refreshments they brought every month, Pauline stood and turned to face the man who had been sitting beside her for 6 consecutive months. "Mr. Finley," she said. He stood, because he was the kind of man who stood when a woman addressed him and met her eyes. Up close, she noticed again the particular quality of his attention, the way he looked at a person as though he had decided to give them his full concentration and did not consider this an inconvenience. "Miss Holloway," he said. "I have a question for you," she said, "and I would like an honest answer." Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been the beginning of a wry acknowledgement, though he kept his face otherwise composed. "All right," he said. "Why do you sit beside me at every gathering?" she asked. "Not sometimes. Every time. You find wherever I'm sitting and you sit there. You have done this every month since April, and you never explain yourself." The hall was loud enough around them that their conversation was private, but she watched his eyes move briefly across her face, taking in the directness of the question with what she read as something between relief and nerves. "Because," he said, and then stopped. "Because," she repeated, giving him space to continue. He looked at her steadily. "Because it's the best part of my month," he said. "Sitting where you are, even without saying anything, it's the best part." Pauline Holloway had prepared herself for a variety of answers. She had prepared for something prosaic, something territorial, something she could easily dismiss. She had not prepared for honesty delivered with that particular quiet weight. "That," she said after a moment, "is either the most unusual thing a man has ever said to me or the most sincere." "I expect it might be both," Owen said. She looked at him for a long moment, reading the steadiness in his face, the absence of performance. He was not trying to be charming. He was trying to be accurate, and accuracy in her experience was considerably rarer and considerably more valuable than charm. "I see," she said. "I realize," he said, "that I should have said something sooner. It wasn't fair to you not to explain. I just didn't know how to begin." "You've just begun," she said, "quite adequately." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the honest precursor to one, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she wanted to see the full version of it. "Would you," he said, with the carefulness of a man venturing onto uncertain ground he has thought about for a long time, "allow me to walk you home after this evening is done?" Pauline considered him. She thought about 6 months of unspoken intention, about the single sentence of praise he had offered her in August, about the 2 steers he had volunteered without hesitation for the harvest celebration, about the way he held his hat in his hands like a man who knew how to wait. "Yes," she said. "I would allow that." He nodded, and she saw the slight ease of tension in his shoulders, and she thought, there it is, he has been carrying that question for quite some time. They parted to speak with other people for the remainder of the evening, and Pauline circulated through the hall with the specific awareness of a woman who knows someone across the room is keeping track of where she is, which was a feeling so unfamiliar to her that she had to take a moment by the refreshment table to examine it carefully. She decided, examining it, that she did not dislike it. Clara Marsh appeared at her elbow with the unerring instinct she had for being present at significant moments. "You spoke to him," Clara said. "How do you know?" Pauline said. "Because you both look," Clara said, selecting the precise word with visible satisfaction, relieved. The walk home was 4 blocks through a town that was quiet in the particular way that frontier towns went quiet at night, which was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of people who had worked very hard all day and needed the dark to put them horizontal again. The lanterns in the saloon on Main Street threw warm light onto the packed dirt of the road, and somewhere a horse shifted in its paddock, and the night air carried the smell of dry grass and wood smoke. Owen walked beside her at a comfortable distance, not so close as to presume, not so far as to seem indifferent. He had his hat back on his head, pushed slightly back in the way that men who spent their days outdoors pushed their hats when they were not actively working, and he matched his stride to hers without appearing to think about it. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, because she was a person who found conversation easier with a subject, and because she genuinely wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people who do not talk much are quiet when asked a direct question, organizing their thoughts rather than filling space. "It's 4 sections," he said. "My father started with 2. I added the other 2 when the Grayson family sold up and moved to Colorado 4 years back. I run about 200 head. It's not the biggest operation in the county, but it's solid. It works." "You built that yourself," she said. "After your father passed." He glanced at her, and she understood that she had touched something real. "I had help," he said. "Cal Reeves and a man named Martinez who have been with me since the start, but the decisions were mine." "That's a lot to carry for a young man," she said. 23, he agreed. "There were weeks I didn't sleep much." "But the cattle don't care about your grief, which is actually useful. They keep needing you, and so you keep going." Pauline thought about that. She had arrived in Caldwell Creek at roughly the same time he had been inheriting that difficult weight, and she had been a stranger to him then, and he had been a stranger to her, and the town had been a stranger to them both in different ways, and somehow here they were, walking together in the October night. "What made you start coming to the gatherings?" she asked. He was quiet again. Then, with a frankness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he spoke when he decided to speak. "I came for the first one because it seemed like the right thing to do, being part of the community. I kept coming because of you." She stopped walking. He stopped a half step later and turned to look at her. "Since when?" she said. "The first one I attended," he said. "April 2 years ago. You stood up to address a question about the school's funding, and you were so precise and so certain and so entirely unintimidated by the room that I thought, that is a remarkable woman." He paused. "Then I found the bench beside you at the next gathering because I wanted to be near that. I didn't have a plan beyond that." 2 years, she said. 2 years, he confirmed. She stared at him in the lantern-lit dark, this man who had sat beside her for 2 years of gatherings, counting the months differently in her memory now, realizing she had only noticed the pattern for the past 6 months, but that it had been running long before she had started paying attention. "Owen Finley," she said, and her voice had something in it that was not quite laughter but was close to it. "Do you understand how strange that is?" "I do," he said. "I'm not a man who says things before I'm sure of them. I kept thinking there would be a right moment, and then the right moment kept not arriving because I kept waiting for something that doesn't actually appear on its own." "You have to make it." "You made it tonight," she said. "You made it tonight," he corrected. "You asked me directly. I was grateful for it." She started walking again, and he fell into step beside her, and the block to the schoolhouse passed in a silence that was entirely different from the months of silence on those wooden benches, this silence being the warm and slightly breathless kind that follows something important being said. At her porch she turned and faced him in the light of the lamp she had left burning in her window. "I would like," she said, "for you to come to dinner on Sunday, if you are willing to tell me more things directly, the way you did tonight." His smile, finally and fully present, was a quiet and genuine thing, and it changed his face entirely, and she understood immediately why she had been wanting to see it. "I'll be here at noon," he said. "Good night, Mr. Finley," she said. "Good night, Miss Holloway," he said, and touched the brim of his hat and walked back the way they had come, and she stood on her porch and watched him go until the dark swallowed the line of his shoulders. Inside, she sat down at her small kitchen table without taking her coat off, and stayed there for a while with her hands folded in front of her, and the kind of expression on her face that she was glad no one was there to see, because it was the expression of a woman who has just discovered that something she had been telling herself was ordinary is in fact remarkable, and that the person responsible for this discovery is considerably more interesting than she had given him proper credit for. Sunday came with the clean, sharp air of early October on the Kansas plains, the sky a deep and unclouded blue above the yellow-going grass, and the cottonwoods along the creek burning gold and amber. Pauline had roasted a chicken and made cornbread and a bean stew with the dried summer beans she kept in the pantry, and she had set her small table with the second tablecloth she owned, the white one with the embroidered edges that her mother had sent from Wichita, along with a letter urging her to not let the frontier turn her into someone who ate standing up. Owen arrived at precisely noon, which told her something about him. He had changed into a clean shirt and his best coat, and he brought a jar of honey from his hives, which were not something she had known he kept, and he handed it to her at the door with a directness that suggested the offering of gifts was not something he did with false modesty. "You keep bees," she said, turning the jar in her hands. The honey was dark and clear, the color of amber light. "My mother kept them," he said. "She taught me. When she moved back east to her sister after my father died, she left me the hives." "She moved back east," Pauline said, standing aside to let him in. "She was never quite built for the frontier," Owen said, removing his hat and holding it. "She tried for a long time, and she was good at it when she had to be, But when my father was gone, she went back to Ohio, and I think she slept better there than she ever did here." He looked around the small room, taking in her shelves of books, the maps pinned to the wall, the children's drawings that she kept because the children made them for her, and she could not bring herself to throw away things made with that kind of earnest intention. "She's well," he added. "She writes. Do you miss her?" Pauline said, setting the honey on the table and moving to the stove. He sat down in the chair she indicated, setting his hat on his knee. "I miss what she was out here," he said. "The version of her that this place required. The Ohio version is softer, which is better for her, I think. She's happier." He paused. "I get along all right." "I expect you do," she said, and there was warmth in it that she did not bother to suppress. They ate for 2 hours. In that time she learned that Owen had read more than she expected, that he had opinions about the territorial government that were sharp and specific and rooted in direct experience, that he could be funny in a way that was entirely dry and caught her off guard so that she laughed without having seen it coming, which she found she preferred to laughter she had prepared for. He learned that she had grown up in a household of 5 siblings, and that her father was a schoolteacher himself, and that she had known since she was 8 years old that she would teach, that this was not something she had drifted into, but something she had aimed at with intention. He learned that she had turned down a position in a larger Kansas City school to come to Caldwell Creek, because something in the description of the smaller, newer place had called to her more than the established institution. "You wanted to build something," he said. "Yes," she said, as though he had said something that explained a thing she had always known but not quite articulated. "I understand that," he said. They looked at each other across the small table with its white embroidered cloth and the jar of amber honey and the remains of the chicken, and something settled between them with the weight and ease of something that has found its right place. October's harvest celebration arrived with cool temperatures and a sky full of the kind of traveling clouds that moved fast over the plains in autumn, and Caldwell Creek turned out in full for it. Children running between the stalls and men gathered around the communal roast, and women trading recipes and judgment in equal measure. The fiddler had brought his nephew, who played the harmonica with more enthusiasm than precision, but made up for it with energy. Owen found Pauline early in the afternoon at the school supplies stall, where she was selling small goods made by her students as a fundraiser for new primers. He appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of sweet cider and handed one to her without ceremony, and she accepted it without ceremony. And Clara Marsh, passing with a basket of preserves, looked at them standing together in comfortable proximity and said nothing, but smiled in a way that communicated a great deal. They spent the afternoon in the loose orbit of each other that new courtship creates, coming together and separating as the social currents of the day required, but always aware, both of them, of where the other was. Pauline watched him with the town's older families and saw how they received him, with the particular respect reserved for someone who had earned his place through consistent, reliable presence rather than personality. He was not the man who made the room louder. He was the man the room was steadier for. In the early evening, when the fiddler had worked the harmonica player up to something approaching competence, and the dancing began on the flat ground behind the hall, Owen appeared beside her. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am a mediocre dancer at best. I should tell you," she said, "that I care more about willingness than skill." He held out his hand, and she took it, and the calluses on his palm were the calluses of a man who worked his own land, and there was something about that specificity that she found unexpectedly moving. He danced the way he did everything else, with quiet, serious attention, not particularly graceful but entirely present, and when he turned her in the figure of a reel his hand at her back was careful and certain, and she thought, "This is a man who knows how to hold something without gripping it." Afterward, when the dancing had gone on long enough that even the children were starting to lean against their parents, they walked to the edge of the gathering where the lantern light faded into the blue dark of the October evening, and stood looking out at the plains that stretched black and enormous in all directions, the grass moving in the wind like something breathing. "I want to tell you something," Owen said. "Then tell me," she said. "I know it's early," he said. "We've had one dinner and one dance and 6 months of me sitting beside you without explaining myself, which I acknowledge is an unconventional beginning." "It is," she agreed. "But I am not a man who says things to hear himself say them," he said. "So when I say that I think you are the most extraordinary person I have encountered in my life on this earth, I want you to understand that I have spent a considerable amount of time being certain of it before I said it." Pauline stood in the dark with the wind moving through the dry grass and the music of the fiddle faint behind them, and looked at this man, this quiet, careful man who had been watching her for 2 years and had waited another 6 months after she noticed before she had to ask him directly to use his voice. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you are extraordinary too," she said. "And I am equally certain of it, though I have had considerably less time to be so." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled the smile she had first seen a week ago, the quiet, real one, and she thought she could probably look at that smile for a very long time without wanting to look at anything else. He did not kiss her that evening. He was too careful for that, too respectful of the pace of things. But he walked her home again, and at her porch he held her hand for a moment before releasing it, and that simple thing, the warmth and steadiness of his hand holding hers in the October night, stayed with her through the week like a note of music that keeps playing in the background of a day. November brought cold mornings and early dark, and a quality of light on the plains that Pauline had come to love above almost all other things, the low gold of the winter sun making everything sharp-edged and clear. Owen came to Sunday dinner every week. They fell into an ease with each other that surprised her by arriving so quickly, though she suspected it was not actually quick at all, that 2 years of sitting beside someone in the particular stillness of his company had built something without her noticing the construction. He told her about his father, not all at once, but in pieces, the way things that have been carried a long time are sometimes released. His father had been a demanding man and a fair one, which was the best combination and also a hard one to measure up to. Owen had spent 3 years after inheriting the ranch doing things precisely as his father would have done them, and it had taken him the 4th year to realize that the ranch could also be done his way without betraying the man who built it. "What's the difference," she asked, "between his way and yours?" "He ran it through authority," Owen said. "I run it through trust. He told Cal and Martinez what to do and they did it. I ask them what they think and we decide together. It's slower, but it's better." He paused. "My father wasn't a bad man. He was a man of his time in that particular way. I just happen to think that way is inefficient." She loved that about him, the way his practical nature and his ethical nature were not separate things but the same thing. He was good because it made sense to him to be good. She told him about the things she had not told many people, the reason she had specifically not come to Caldwell Creek looking for a husband. She had been engaged once in Wichita to a man named Richard Hartley who had been charming and attentive, and who had, 3 months before the planned wedding, revealed himself to be neither of those things in any genuine sense, but rather a man who had wanted the idea of a wife, and had not particularly examined what kind of wife he wanted or what kind of husband he intended to be. The ending of it had been painful not for grief but for embarrassment, for the feeling of having been mistaken about something she had believed she was good at reading. "Which is reading people," Owen said. "Which I prided myself on," she said. "And then I was wrong. And so I came here and I told myself the purpose was the school and I stood behind that for 3 years. And now," he said, she looked at him steadily, "now I think the school is still the purpose. I don't think it has to be the only one." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly and then let it go, and that was all either of them needed to say about that for the time being. November also brought the first serious test of their courtship's young roots in the form of a conflict that was, like most of the serious conflicts in Caldwell Creek, about land. A man named Gerald Price had arrived in the county in September with a land deed that he claimed gave him rights to a piece of property that currently sat between Owen's north boundary and the creek homestead of a family named Flores, a Mexican-American family who had been farming that land since 1871 and who did not have formalized legal title because the process of formalizing title in the territory was slow and expensive and had not always been made accessible to people who were not Anglo. Price was pushing hard, with the kind of confidence that comes from having a lawyer in Topeka who understood how to use the law as a weapon. The Flores family, Ramon and his wife Alina and their 4 children, came to Owen because their north fence line touched his, and because he was the neighbor they trusted most. They came on a Tuesday morning in early November with their paperwork spread on his kitchen table and the particular dignity of people who should not have to justify their right to something they built with their own hands. Owen came to Pauline that evening, not because he wanted her to solve it, but because she had lived in the territory longer than Price had been a problem, and because she knew people in the community, and because he trusted her counsel. "The deed Price has may be technically valid," she said, looking at the copy of the documentation Owen had brought. "But that doesn't mean it was obtained fairly. These things get filed in Topeka by people who know how to navigate the system, and the system has never been designed with families like the Flores in mind." "What can be done?" he said. "The Flores family needs an affidavit of continuous occupancy," she said. "Witnesses who can testify that they have been on that land working it since 1871. That's 7 years of documented presence. If they can establish that in the county records before Price files an eviction claim, it changes the legal picture considerably." "You know how to do that," he said. "I know who can help me do that," she said. "Judge Hartley in Cimarron has handled similar situations. He is, from what I understand, a man who reads the law as it ought to work rather than as it is sometimes made to work." Within 2 weeks, Pauline had gathered 12 signed affidavits from neighbors and townspeople who had witnessed the Flores family's continuous work on that land, and Owen had ridden to Cimarron with her to present the case before Judge Hartley, who was a sharp and white-bearded man who appeared to find the affidavits deeply satisfying to read. "Price's deed was filed 6 months ago," the judge said. "The Flores family's occupancy predates it by 7 years. This court recognizes continuous productive occupancy as foundational to legitimate claim, and I will be filing that recognition in the county record this week." He looked at Price's lawyer, who had ridden from Topeka and appeared to have known this outcome was possible, but to have hoped it would not arrive. "Counsel, your client may seek further legal remedy if he chooses, but he will find the ground considerably less firm than he apparently believed it to be." The ride back to Caldwell Creek from Cimarron was 3 hours in the November cold, and they rode side by side on the hard-packed road with the wind at their backs and the low winter sun making the grass glow, and somewhere in the second hour Owen looked over at her with an expression she was learning to read, which was the expression of a man who is not good at finding words for gratitude but is feeling it very fully. "Thank you," he said. "They deserve to keep what they built," she said. "Yes," he said. "They did, and you didn't need me to do it," she said. "You would have found the way." "I would have found a slower way," he said, "and probably a worse one." She smiled into the cold wind. "We are more useful together than separately." He looked at her then with a quality of attention that was different from the gathering benches, different even from the Sunday dinners, and she understood without him saying it that he was seeing something he had hoped for and was now seeing clearly. "Yes," he said, "we are." When they reached the Flores farm to deliver the news, Alina Flores embraced Pauline with the fierceness of a woman who has been holding her breath for 3 weeks, and Ramon shook Owen's hand for a long time, and the 4 Flores children, ranging from 8 to 15, stood in a row and looked at these two people with the transparent gratitude of children who understand that something important has just been protected. December came and brought real cold, the kind that settled into the plains and stayed, and Owen came to the schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon and waited while she finished her lessons and her students filed out with their coats pulled tight, trailing the usual last day of the week energy. She walked out to find him leaning against the fence post with his collar up against the wind, and her heart did the small, involuntary thing it had been doing with increasing frequency at the sight of him, which was a thing she had stopped trying to manage and had started simply acknowledging. "There is something I would like to show you," he said. "If you can ride." "I can ride," she said. They rode north on his road as the afternoon light went gold and then amber, and he brought her to the edge of a small rise on his land that looked west over a wide sweep of creek and grassland, with his cattle grazing small and dark in the middle distance, and the sky above the horizon doing the specific and extraordinary thing that Kansas winter skies did at that hour, which was to turn colors she did not have accurate names for. A deep burning rose and a purple so deep it was nearly black, and a thin line of pale gold at the very edge of the world. "I come here," he said, "when I need to remember why I stayed." She sat on her horse beside him and watched the light change and understood exactly why he had brought her here instead of telling her about it, because this was not a thing that could be accurately described, only shared. "I watch the sunsets from my porch," she said. "But this is better." "It is," he said simply. The sky went dark and the stars came out over the plains in the enormous and indifferent quantity that cities never saw, and they sat there for a while longer than was probably sensible given the cold, and then rode back through the dark, with the lantern Owen had brought swinging its small circle of light ahead of them. At the fork in the road where his lane split from the town road, he stopped his horse. She stopped hers. The night was very quiet, only the wind moving in the dry grass and the distant sound of water in the creek. He reached across the space between their horses and touched her face with his gloved hand, just briefly, just the edge of her cheek, and looked at her in the way he looked at things he was absolutely certain about. "I would very much like to ask you to marry me," he said. "I am not asking tonight because I think it's too soon, and you would be right to say so. But I want you to know that I am going to ask." "Owen Finley," she said, and her voice was doing something she did not entirely have control of, "are you warning me about your intentions?" "I am telling you the truth about them," he said, "so you can decide what you want." She looked at him in the lantern light for a long moment. "I have already decided," she said, "but I appreciate the honesty." "Then we understand each other," he said. "We understand each other perfectly," she said. He rode home along his lane, and she rode toward the town lights with the cold wind on her face, and the stars above the entire plains, and the feeling of a future opening up in front of her like a door swung wide into a room full of warm light. January and February were hard months on the plains, the kind of hard that winnowed the romanticized idea of frontier life down to its actual substance, which was work and weather, and the maintenance of life against conditions that did not care whether you survived them. Owen's cattle needed constant attention in the worst cold, and there were 2 days when a blizzard came down from the north that kept everyone indoors and left the landscape transformed by a white so complete that it erased all the familiar shapes. During those months, their courtship continued in the practical way that made sense in that environment. Shared work and shared meals, and a deepening of the particular conversation that had no ending point, the ongoing exchange of two people discovering each other. Owen helped her split the wood she needed for the schoolhouse stove when her supply ran low after the blizzard, and she brought soup to his ranch when he was down with a chest cold for a week in February. And Cal Reeves, his hired hand, a weather-worn man of 40 who had the specific wisdom of someone who had seen everything and judged most of it gently, looked at Pauline when she arrived with the soup and said, in a tone that conveyed volumes in 5 words, "He'll be glad you're here." Owen's chest cold resolved in a week, and he was embarrassed to have been seen in an unguarded state. And she thought the embarrassment was sweet and also slightly unnecessary, and told him so, which made him shake his head in the way he did when he found something funny but was too stubborn to fully admit it. In March, when the first warmth returned and the creek ran high with snowmelt and the earliest prairie flowers opened in the mud at the field margins, he asked her. They were on his porch after Sunday dinner, watching the last of the daylight leave the western sky, the same sky she watched from her porch in town, and he stood beside her in the way he had always been very good at standing beside her, present and solid and entirely himself, and he said, "I have been waiting for the right moment, and I have learned that the right moment is the one you make." "I have heard that before," she said very quietly. "Pauline," he said, and turned to face her. "Will you marry me?" She turned to face him, this man who had sat beside her in silence for 2 years because he loved her and did not know how to begin, this man who ran his ranch through trust and kept bees and brought her honey and rode to Cimarron in the cold to help a family keep their land and showed her the sunset from the best angle he knew. "Yes," she said, "I will." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she recognized as his version of joy, which was not a loud or demonstrative thing but was deep and absolutely real, and then he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring that had been his mother's, a small garnet set in gold, and put it on her finger with the careful steadiness of a man who had practiced this very little but meant it very much. She looked at the ring on her hand in the fading light. "Your mother's," she said. "She sent it with her blessing," he said. "She wanted you to have it." "She doesn't know me," Pauline said. "She knows what I've written about you in every letter for the past 2 years," he said. "She's been expecting this." Pauline laughed. She laughed completely and without restraint, the kind of laughter that surprised her, and he watched her with the small smile she had come to think of as her favorite sight in the world, and she thought, all those months of silence on those wooden benches, and he had been writing about her in letters to Ohio. The idea of it undid something in her chest that she hadn't realized was tightly wound. They were married on the first Saturday of May 1879, in the church hall, where they had sat beside each other through so many town gatherings. Reverend Alley's performed the ceremony with the warm brevity that suited the occasion, and the entire town came, because Caldwell Creek was the kind of town that showed up for its own. Clara Marsh cried with total unself-consciousness in the front row, and Ned patted her hand with the patient affection of a man accustomed to his wife feeling things thoroughly. Cal Reeves stood with the other Finley Ranch hands in their best clothes with their hair brushed, and Martinez, who was not a demonstrative man, had polished his boots to a shine that caught the light. Ramon and Alina Flores were there with all 4 children, and Alina had brought flowers from the first of her spring planting. The schoolchildren, led out for the occasion by unanimous parental agreement, filled the back rows with the restless, cheerful energy of children, at an event that they understood to be important without entirely knowing why. Pauline wore her good dress, the deep blue one she had brought from Wichita and had worn only on particular occasions, and she had let her hair down in the way she wore it on Sunday evenings. And Owen, in his good coat and his best boots, looked at her walking toward him with an expression that made Clara cry harder. They said their vows in the plain and direct language of the frontier marriage ceremony, and when the Reverend said the words that made them husband and wife, Owen kissed her with the same quality that characterized everything he did, entirely present and entirely certain, and the assembled town of Caldwell Creek made the noise that crowds make at weddings when the sentiment in the room has been successfully building and has found its proper release. The celebration after was the best party Caldwell Creek had thrown since the first harvest celebration, and the fiddler and his nephew were both in better form than they had ever been for an October gathering, whether from practice or from the specific musical motivation of a wedding. The dancing went on until the lanterns burned low, and Owen danced with Pauline with the same serious, willing attention he had brought to the harvest reel. And this time it felt entirely different, because this time they were dancing as people who had committed the whole of their futures to each other, which changed the weight and the meaning of a hand at a back and a hand held, changed it into something that was no longer a gesture of potential, but a declaration of fact. They rode out to the ranch in Owen's wagon in the May night, the plains smelling of new grass and the sky impossibly full of stars, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat with her shoulder against his, and he drove with one hand and put his other arm around her, and neither of them said very much because neither of them needed to. The ranch house was plain and practical, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a sitting room with a stone fireplace, and he had put fresh wood on the fire before they left for the wedding so it would be warm when they returned, which was a detail so characteristically thoughtful that she had to stop in the doorway for a moment. "You planned ahead," she said. "I always plan ahead," he said. "You know this about me by now." "I do," she said, and they both heard the echo of the words they had just said in the church and smiled at the same moment. Summer came to the Finley Ranch and Caldwell Creek in the slow, bountiful way of Kansas summers, the days long and hot and full of work, the evenings cooling to something merciful, the creek busy with children and frogs and the particular activity that water inspires in July. Pauline continued her teaching through the spring term and organized the summer programs she had always run for families who wanted their children to keep reading. And she brought her books from the schoolhouse annex to the ranch on her days off and read on the porch in the afternoon, with the satisfying feeling of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Owen's cattle were in good condition after the spring rains, and he had a solid season's sales at the Caldwell market in June, and he came home from those market days with the particular satisfied energy of a man whose work has been validated in the most direct possible way, which is to say financially. They sat on the porch those evenings and talked about the ranch's future, about whether to expand the herd or diversify into horses, about the well that needed drilling on the north section, about the shed that could become a proper workshop if they invested the time in it. She found that she loved these practical conversations with a depth she had not anticipated, because they were conversations about building, and she had, it turned out, always been a builder of things, whether classrooms or futures. In August she realized she was expecting their first child. She told Owen on a Friday evening when he came in from the summer cattle work, and she had set the table and made his coffee and was standing at the stove with a quality of stillness that he noticed immediately. "Tell me," he said without preamble, reading her the way he had been reading her for years by now. She turned and looked at him, and she was smiling, and he saw the smile before anything else, and his face opened in a way she had only seen a few times, with that complete and unguarded joy. "A child," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and held her with the combination of gentleness and strength that she had come to think of as entirely him, and said nothing for a moment because he did not need to. And she rested her head against his shoulder and thought about the first Saturday of every month, about a man who had found the bench beside her and stayed there for 2 years because she was the best part of his month, and about the long road from that first April gathering to this kitchen in the August heat with his arms around her and a new life beginning. "A boy or a girl?" he said, finally, pulling back to look at her. "I don't know yet," she said. "Either." "Either," he agreed, and the simple completeness of the word, its total acceptance of whatever was coming, was so exactly like him that she kissed him for it. The September gathering, which they attended together now with the easy naturalness of a married couple who have found their rhythm in public as in private, brought a new piece of town business that Pauline cared about deeply. The school board was considering consolidating Caldwell Creek School with the larger school in Harper, the next town 8 miles east, on the grounds that it would be more economically efficient. The Harper School was larger and better funded and had 2 teachers and more textbooks, but it was 8 miles away from children who walked or rode a horse to school in all weather, and efficiency did not account for the 3 winter months when the road to Harper was routinely impassable. Pauline spoke at the gathering with the fullness of her feeling and the whole of her knowledge, and she was 5 months pregnant by then, which in no way diminished the precision or the conviction of her argument, though she was aware of one or two board members looking at her condition as though expecting it to somehow undercut her authority on the matter. It did not. She spoke for 9 minutes about the specific children and their specific circumstances, about the florist children who were making real academic progress and would be set back badly by an 8-mile journey that their family could not reliably make in winter, about the Mitchell twins whose father worked the morning shift at the mill and could not drive them to Harper. She spoke about what a school means to a community that is still growing, that is still deciding whether it is a real and lasting place or a temporary settlement, that it means we intend to be here for long enough to teach our children here. Owen sat beside her in their usual place, and she felt his quiet certainty at her shoulder like a hand at her back. The board voted to keep the school. It was not even close. Walking out of the hall, she and Owen were accompanied by the florist children who had attended with their parents, and the youngest one, a boy named Miguel who was 8 and had recently learned to read and could not stop, pressed a folded piece of paper into Pauline's hand and ran back to his family. She opened it. He had written, in careful letters that showed the effort and pride of recent acquisition, "Thank you, Mrs. Finley." She folded it back up and kept it in her coat pocket for a long time. The baby came in February 1880, on a night of thin, cold snow that lay over the plains in the pale, quiet way of February snow, and he came into the world with some urgency and considerable noise, which Dr. Whitmore, who had ridden out from town in the cold, described as a very healthy indicator. He was a boy, and he had Owen's dark hair and Pauline's green eyes, and when Owen held him for the first time he stood in the lamplight of their bedroom with this small new person in his arms, and looked at his wife with an expression she had never seen on a human face before, a mixture of absolute certainty and absolute wonder, as though the world had just confirmed something and exceeded the expectation at the same time. "Samuel," Owen said. They had agreed on the name. Samuel Owen Finley for Owen's father. "Samuel," she agreed from the pillow. The baby looked at nothing in particular with the nearsighted wondering gaze of all newborns, and Owen looked at Pauline, and she looked at Owen, and the snow came down softly outside, and the fire in the grate kept the room warm, and the whole world was that room for a while, just the three of them and the lamp and the snow. Spring came back to the plains with its usual insistence, the green arriving in the brown grass like a rumor that gradually became a fact, and Caldwell Creek grew a little larger, as it had done every year since its founding, with 2 new families arriving in April to homestead the sections east of town, and a new blacksmith setting up on the south end of Main Street. The town was finding its permanence, settling into the specific confidence of a settlement that has decided it will be there for a long time. The April gathering was the first one Pauline had attended with the baby, and she sat in her usual place with Samuel asleep in the sling against her chest, and Owen sat beside her, and there was something about that alignment, the 3 of them on that bench, that felt like the natural culmination of everything that had begun on that same bench 2 years earlier. Clara Marsh sat 2 rows ahead and turned around at one point to look at them with the expression of someone who has watched a story unfold from the first page and is feeling the satisfaction of a particularly good last chapter. Pauline caught her eye, and Clara mouthed something that she read as about time, which made her press her lips together to suppress the laughter. The next year moved forward with the steady, beautiful accumulation of a life that is working as it should. Pauline returned to teaching in the fall when Samuel was old enough to spend his days with Elena Flores, who had offered without being asked, and whom Pauline trusted completely. The arrangement suited everyone, and Samuel grew up in 2 households and was loved in both, which is a fine start for a person. Owen expanded the herd carefully, adding 40 head in a season when the cattle market was good and the grass was strong. Cal Reeves turned 50 and announced no intention of retiring, which Owen received with visible relief. Martinez, whose first name Pauline finally learned was Diego, met a woman from the Cimarron settlement named Rosaria, and they married in July, and Owen gave them 3 days off for the occasion, which was more than anyone expected, but exactly what Owen would do. The ranch grew, not quickly but surely. Owen drilled the north well he had been planning. The workshop took shape that autumn. He added a room to the ranch house for Samuel, a proper bedroom rather than the corner of theirs where the cradle had stood, and he built it himself over 3 weekends with Cal's help and Pauline's opinions about the window placement, which he received with the patience of a man who had learned that her opinions about light were worth taking seriously. At the town gathering in October 1881, the harvest celebration again, the fiddler and his nephew had by now been replaced by a small but competent group of musicians who had coalesced into something approaching a proper band over the previous 2 years of practice and the powerful motivation of a celebrating community. The dancing was better than it had ever been. Owen danced with Pauline to a waltz that the band played somewhat uncertainly but with genuine feeling, and she danced with a 2-year-old Samuel balanced on her hip for one song, which made everyone watching smile with the particular helplessness that toddlers on dance floors induce. And then Owen took the boy and danced with him in the way that large men dance with very small children, with enormous seriousness and complete tenderness. Pauline stood at the edge of the dancing ground and watched the man she loved dance with the son they had made together under the October stars of the Kansas plains, the lanterns casting their warm old light over the celebration of a community that had decided to survive and had succeeded. And she thought about the first time she had sat down in the church hall, and a quiet man had settled beside her without explanation, and about the long and necessary road that had run from that unexplained presence to this night. She thought about what it means to choose a life on the frontier, the difficulty of it and the specific beauty of that difficulty. The way hardship and joy were not opposites here, but were woven through each other in a way that made each one more real. She had come west looking for purpose, and she had found it in 31 children who were now closer to 45, and in a man who thought ahead and spoke rarely and meant every word, and in a son who was going to grow up running over this grass and swimming in this creek and learning that the world required both work and wonder. Clara Marsh appeared beside her, as Clara Marsh always seemed to appear at the moments that mattered. "Are you happy?" Clara said. "Entirely," Pauline said. Clara looked at her with the satisfaction of a woman whose understanding of people had proven correct. "I knew it, you know," she said. "From the first month you mentioned him sitting beside you, I knew exactly what it was." "You could have told me," Pauline said. "You needed to ask him yourself," Clara said. "That was the whole point." And she was right about that, Pauline thought. She had needed to ask him directly, to be the one who broke the silence, because it had taught her something about him that all the months of observation could not have told her as clearly. It had taught her that when he finally spoke, what he said was the truest thing she had ever heard a person say, that sitting beside her was the best part of his month, said without flourish, without performance, with only the bare weight of a man who has chosen his words because he has something real to say with them. Owen came back to her side with Samuel asleep against his shoulder, the boy having succumbed in the middle of the dancing to the irresistible pull of exhaustion, and Owen's arm was easy and practiced around the sleeping weight of him. He looked at her in the lantern light. "Ready?" he said. "Nearly," she said. "Take your time," he said, and waited beside her the way he was very good at waiting, patient and steady, looking out over the gathering with the expression of a man who is content with where he is. That winter was mild compared to the previous 2, and the ranch settled into its cold months with the established rhythm of a place that knows its work. Samuel, walking now with a confidence that exceeded his coordination, discovered the barn with the intensity of a small person who has found the best room in the world, and Owen introduced him to the horses with the same careful quiet he brought to everything, crouching down to put the boy's small hand on a warm nose. Pauline watched from the barn door and thought about patience, about how much she had undervalued it before she understood what it looked like in practice. Owen's patience was not passive. It was active and purposeful, the patience of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed without being damaged, that some things needed the full amount of time they needed. She had rushed in Wichita with Richard Hartley, driven by the social pressure of a certain kind of expectation. She had not rushed here. She had, if anything, almost been too careful in the other direction, telling herself for 3 years that purpose was sufficient, that she did not need more than the school and the work. And then a quiet man had sat beside her for 6 months before she finally asked him directly what he was doing there, and his answer had been so entirely without pretense that it had dismantled her carefully constructed distance in a single sentence. In the spring of 1882, she discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Owen in the same kitchen on a Friday evening, and his response was the same complete unguarded joy it had been the first time, which she found deeply reassuring, that a thing that was wonderful the first time was no less wonderful the second. This one was a girl. She came in November, loud and definite, with Pauline's brown hair and Owen's gray eyes, and they named her Clara Me, for Clara Marsh, who had been a consistent friend, and for the month of May in which Pauline and Owen had married. And when Clara Marsh heard the name, she sat down at her store counter and cried without apology. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said, when she had recovered enough to speak. "We wanted to," Pauline said. "She's named for someone who knew what was happening before I did. That deserves recognition." Samuel, 2 years old, regarded his new sister with the specific expression of a toddler attempting to understand something large, which was a process that took several weeks and concluded with a verdict of cautious acceptance that gradually became something resembling proprietary devotion, in the way that older siblings sometimes arrive at love through the roundabout route of territory. Owen was a father with the same quality he was everything else, entirely present and thoroughly grounded, and he moved through the daily reality of 2 young children with a practicality and tenderness that Pauline found, if anything, more attractive than she had found anything about him before, which she had not thought was possible and was pleased to discover was wrong. The ranch continued to grow. The school continued to grow. Caldwell Creek itself continued to grow, adding its saloon and its barbershop and its small hotel, and eventually a second general store. And with each addition it became more definitively itself, a real and lasting place on the plains of Kansas where people had built their lives with considerable effort and genuine love. The town gatherings continued on the first Saturday of each month, a constant through all the changes, and Pauline and Owen attended every one. They sat in their usual places, third bench from the front on the left side, and sometimes they had Samuel with them, and then Samuel and Clara Me. And the bench was fuller than it had been in those early months, but the quality of sitting beside each other was unchanged, was in fact deepened by everything that had accumulated between that first unexplained seating and this present reality. There was a gathering in October 1883 that Pauline would remember for a long time, when the mayor announced that the town had been approved for a telegraph line connection that would link Caldwell Creek to Wichita and eventually to the larger national network, a change that would make the town feel considerably less remote and considerably more part of the world beyond the plains. People were excited, and the celebration after the formal meeting was particularly warm. In the middle of the evening, Pauline found herself standing with Owen and the Flores family and Clara and Ned Marsh and Cal Reeves and a dozen other people who had been part of the town's fabric since the beginning, people she had come to love with the specific love that you develop for the people you have built things beside. And she thought about the first October gathering she had attended 5 years ago, when she was new and still figuring out the shape of this place. And she looked around the room at what it had become, and felt something that she could only describe as profound satisfaction. Owen was beside her as he had always been, and he looked at her in the way that meant he was reading her thoughts with the accuracy that came from 5 years of daily close attention. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking that it turned out well," she said. He considered the room, the people, the lamplit warmth of it. "Yes," he said, "it did." "Because of a bench," she said quietly. He looked at her, the small, real smile. "Because you asked me directly. Because you were honest when I did," she said. "I was always going to be honest with you," he said. "I just needed you to give me the opening." She took his hand. There in the middle of the gathering room, with the fiddler starting up something energetic and Samuel pulling at Cal Reeves's sleeve, and Clara Mee asleep in Alina Flores's arms, and she held it with the same easy grip she had held it through 5 years of this life. "I love you, Owen Finley," she said, directly, in the way she had learned to say things from living beside him. "I love you, Pauline Holloway," he said, and then corrected himself, Pauline Finley, with a satisfaction in the correction that she found ridiculous and entirely endearing. "Both," she said. "I am still both." "You are," he said. "You always will be." The telegraph line came to Caldwell Creek in the spring of 1884, strung on poles that went up in a matter of weeks, and connected the town to the wider world with an immediacy that felt remarkable to everyone who had grown up understanding the frontier primarily as distance. Pauline's first telegram was to her mother in Wichita, and she sent it from the new telegraph office on a Tuesday morning with Samuel beside her watching the operator work the key with a child's absolute fascination. Her mother telegrammed back within the hour, received, very proud. "When are you visiting?" She showed it to Owen over dinner. "A visit is not a terrible idea," he said. "To Wichita," she said. "You haven't been back since you came here," he said. "Your family hasn't met the children properly. Cal can manage the ranch for a week." She looked at him. "You would come?" "Of course I would come," he said, in a tone that suggested the question was unnecessary. "You have never traveled to Wichita," she said. "I have never had a reason to," he said. They went in July, a journey of 2 days by rail that Samuel found spectacular and Clara Mee found overstimulating, and that Pauline found unexpectedly emotional, watching the plains she had made her home recede, and then watching the outskirts of Wichita approach, the city of her childhood and her training arriving larger and louder than the memory of it. Her family met them at the station. Her mother, a woman who had given Pauline both her directness and her capability, examined Owen for approximately 30 seconds and then looked at her daughter with an expression that said, "This is right, I can see it." Her father shook Owen's hand and asked him immediately about the ranch, and they spent the following 4 days in conversation that was part getting to know you, and part the immediate ease of two people who like each other, and have no reason to pretend otherwise. Samuel spent the visit in rapturous exploration of his grandparents' house and garden. Clara Mee charmed everyone with the completeness of her personality, which was already fully present at 20 months, a person of strong opinions and considerable warmth who knew what she wanted and expected the world to deliver it, which it generally did. On the last evening, Pauline sat with her mother on the back porch while the men were inside talking and the children were asleep, and her mother said, "Tell me the beginning. Tell me how it started." So Pauline told her about the bench and the 6 months of silence and the question she had finally asked directly, and the answer he had given her that was so honest it had changed the whole shape of things. Her mother listened with the complete attention that good listeners have, and when it was done she said, "He waited because he was certain. Some men court before they're certain, which is fair enough, but the men who wait until they're absolutely sure are the ones who stay." "He stayed," Pauline said. "I can see that," her mother said. "I can see it in how he looks at you. He's not looking to see what you are. He already knows what you are and he's just glad to be near it." Pauline thought about that on the train home, through the big Kansas sky and the plains opening up brown and gold around them as they came back toward home, and she thought it was accurate. She had been seen and understood and chosen by a man who had done all of that before he ever said a single word to her, and then had sat beside her in the best silence she had ever experienced until she asked him to speak. The years that followed Pauline and Owen's second child moved forward with the accumulating richness of a life fully lived. Samuel grew into a boy of serious curiosity and considerable stubbornness, which were traits from both of them in different proportions, and he could be found most days either in the barn with the horses or at his mother's kitchen table with a book, rarely anywhere between. Clara Mee grew into a girl of extraordinary social competence, knowing at 6 what most people did not know at 20 about how to make someone feel welcome, which was a gift with both its mother's roots and something entirely its own. Owen taught them both to ride properly at ages he considered appropriate, which were younger than Pauline considered appropriate, and there was a recurring and affectionate argument about this that never fully resolved because they were both partly right, which was the condition of most of their disagreements. Pauline taught them to read beyond what the school required, pushing past the expected boundaries with the passion of someone who knew firsthand what books contained and wanted them to have access to all of it. Owen taught them to work with their hands, to mend a fence and shoe a horse, and understand how water runs on land and how land heals when it is treated properly. In 1885, Cal Reeves asked if he could build a small house on the north section of the ranch rather than live in the bunkhouse he had occupied for 12 years. Owen agreed immediately and helped him build it, and Cal lived there for the rest of his life with the contentment of a man who has found his permanent place, which was, Owen told Pauline, the best possible outcome for someone who had earned it. The town continued. The school continued. The monthly gatherings continued, and Pauline and Owen attended every one, and they always sat in the same place. And anyone who had been in Caldwell Creek for any length of time knew that the third bench from the front on the left was where you would find the Finleys, together and present and entirely at ease in each other's company, which was a kind of public declaration that required no words at all. Clara Marsh, at the gathering of April 1886, found Pauline at the refreshment table and stood beside her with a cup of tea and the expression of someone about to say something definitive. "Do you remember," Clara said, "when you came to me in the summer of 1878 and told me about the man who kept sitting beside you?" "I remember," Pauline said, "and I told you he wanted to be near you and you said he ought to say so." "I remember that too," Pauline said and laughed. "And then you asked him directly," Clara said. "And here we are." "Here we are," Pauline agreed, looking across the hall to where Owen was deep in conversation with Ned Marsh and two of the newer ranching families, his arms crossed in the way he crossed them when he was engaged and thinking seriously. 8 years, Clara said. "Nearly 9, Pauline said. "And 2 children, Clara said. "2 children, Pauline agreed. "Samuel is 6 and Clara Mee is 3, and I expect there will be more." She paused. "We've discussed it." Clara looked at her with undisguised delight. "Have you?" "We tend to discuss things directly," Pauline said. "It's become a household standard." She said it lightly, but it was true in the deepest possible sense. Their house was a house where things were said, where questions were asked and answered honestly, where disagreements were named and worked through, rather than allowed to accumulate in the background. This was not always comfortable, but it was always real, and real had turned out to be the thing she valued most, more than smooth, more than easy, more than the careful management of appearances that she had watched other people maintain at considerable cost. Owen had taught her that by example. Not by lecturing her about honesty, which would have been pointless given that she was already an honest person, but by being so consistently and quietly direct himself that it became the natural language of their household, the way that families develop their own particular idioms for the things they care about. The third child arrived in 1887, a boy they named Thomas. He was red-haired, which surprised everyone, though Pauline's mother confirmed in a letter that her own grandfather had been red-haired, and the trait had simply been lying in wait for the right combination. Thomas was red-haired and extremely loud, and had decided opinions about everything from birth, and the ranch responded to him the way it responded to most things, by absorbing his presence and continuing to function around it. Samuel, who was 7 when Thomas arrived, looked at his new brother with the expression of someone who has just been handed a lifelong responsibility and has decided, after careful consideration, to accept it. Clara Mee looked at him with the open enthusiasm of someone who has wanted an audience for her social skills and has just been provided with the most captive possible one. Owen held Thomas with the same expression he had worn holding Samuel and Clara Mee, complete and wondering, and Pauline looked at him holding their third child in the warm light of the bedroom and thought about how love does not divide, it multiplies, which is something she had understood abstractly and now understood in her body. The ranch in 1887 was a considerable operation, 300 head and a well-run working property, with a reputation for honest dealing that made their cattle a reliable commodity at the Caldwell market. Owen had been approached twice about selling to the larger cattle concerns moving into the territory, and had declined both times without drama, simply saying that the ranch was not for sale, which was a complete answer. Pauline's school had grown to 60 students, and the school board had finally approved a second teacher, a young woman from Lawrence named Margaret Doyle, who arrived in September 1887, and was excellent and enthusiastic, and had the additional quality of being completely unintimidated by Pauline, which was the quality most likely to result in a successful professional relationship. The two women divided the students by age and worked as a team, and the school became something they were both genuinely proud of, a real institution in a real town, the kind of school that sent children forward into their lives equipped not just with reading and arithmetic, but with a genuine love of knowledge, which was the thing Pauline had always considered the true product of education. At the town gathering of September 1888, Pauline sat in her usual bench with Owen beside her and Thomas, who was 1 year old and determinedly awake, on her knee, and Samuel and Clara Mee on Owen's other side, and looked around the hall at the town she had chosen and had helped to build, and felt the satisfaction of it in a way that was so complete it was almost physical. The mayor was speaking about the construction of a proper town hall, which would finally give these monthly gatherings a permanent home rather than the church hall, which had always been generous of the reverend to offer and slightly cramped for a town this size. There was discussion about location and funding and the design, and people argued with the passionate investment of people who have been building something together for a long time and have strong opinions about how it should look. Owen raised his hand and suggested a site near the creek that would give the hall space to expand as the town continued to grow, and people thought about it and argued about it, and eventually agreed it was a good idea. And Pauline watched him contribute to the governance of the place he had always intended to be part of and felt, as she frequently felt, the specific satisfaction of being loved by someone she also admired. After the gathering, walking home in the September evening, they walked the four of them with Thomas on Owen's shoulders and Samuel running ahead and Clara Mee holding her father's hand, and the town was quiet around them and the stars were coming out over the plains and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to turn. "I was thinking," Pauline said. "Tell me," he said. "About the beginning," she said. "About how it started. I think about it sometimes." "What do you think about it?" he said. "I think about the fact that you sat beside me for 2 years before I asked you why," she said. "And I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I hadn't asked. Whether you would have said something eventually." He was quiet for a moment, the thinking before speaking quiet she knew so well. "Eventually," he said, "I would have gotten there, but I don't know when. It might have been a long time." "What stopped you?" she said. "Those first 2 years." "Certainty in one direction and uncertainty in another," he said. "I was certain what I felt. I was not certain it would be welcome, and I was afraid if I was honest of being wrong about you." because I had made you into something very specific in my mind, something I valued enormously, and I didn't know if the real version could hold up to what I'd imagined. And, she said. He looked at her in the evening light, this woman who had grown into the most important person in his life so thoroughly that he could not cleanly separate himself from her anymore, which was not a loss of self but an expansion of it, which was something he had not fully understood was possible until it happened. The real version exceeded it by a significant margin, he said. On every front. She stopped walking and turned to face him. Samuel was half a block ahead, too far to hear. Clara Mee was looking at something in the grass. Thomas was patting Owen's hat with the methodical absorption of a 1-year-old who has found an interesting object. Owen Finley, she said. Do you know what I thought when you gave me that answer at the gathering? The first honest answer. What did you think? He said. I thought, this is either the most unusual thing a man has ever said to me or the most sincere, and I have never been more glad to have been right about the second one. He smiled the smile, the full one, the quiet real one she had first seen at the September gathering of 1878 and had looked at every day since. You were always going to ask me, he said. I think I knew that. I think I might have been waiting for you too. That is, she said, the most ridiculous thing you have ever said to me. Probably, he said, but it might also be true. It might also be true, she admitted. Thomas chose this moment to remove Owen's hat and throw it with considerable accuracy into the grass, which broke the moment in the way that small children break moments, without apology and with full effectiveness. Owen retrieved his hat and resettled it, and Clara Mee came to take Pauline's hand, and Samuel came running back to report something he had seen at the creek, and they walked on together through the September evening, the 5 of them making their easy way through the town that was theirs, built and loved and lived in, under the enormous and patient Kansas sky. The town hall was completed in the spring of 1889, a good solid building of local stone near the creek bend that Owen had recommended, with high windows and a proper stage, and enough benches to seat the whole of Caldwell Creek, with room to spare for the visitors and newcomers who were still finding their way to this particular corner of the plains. The first town gathering held there was in April, and it was festive and full, and Pauline sat in the 3rd row from the front on the left with Owen beside her, and all 3 children arranged along the bench beside him, Samuel reading quietly, Clara Mee watching everything with her characteristic focused attention, Thomas sitting still for approximately 4 minutes before requiring management. The Reverend opened with a prayer that thanked the community for its persistence and its care for each other, and Pauline thought that was exactly right, that persistence and care were the 2 things that made a community worth belonging to, and that she had seen both of them in Owen and in this town and in herself, practiced for long enough now that they had become not virtues she was working at, but simply how she moved through the world. The decade turned. The children grew. The ranch deepened in its maturity. The school produced generation after generation of students who carried what they had learned into the wider world and sometimes brought it back, the way roots keep giving even when the plant has moved on. Owen and Pauline grew older in each other's company with the ease that comes from having built something real together, from having faced the hard seasons and the good ones with honesty and full presence, from having chosen each other not in the abstract warmth of new feeling, but in the specific and daily reality of a shared life. They still sat in the same bench at every gathering. They still walked home through the town in the evenings, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes in the ongoing conversation that their marriage had become, a conversation with no ending point that simply continued and deepened with time, gaining references and layers, and the specific humor that only comes from 2 people who have been paying close attention to each other for a very long time. On a first Saturday in October 1890, 12 years to the month after a quiet man had first settled onto the bench beside a woman he had been watching since April, and had not yet found the words to approach, Owen Finley sat beside Pauline Finley at the harvest celebration in the new town hall, their 3 children beside them, The hall full of people they loved and had built things with. The fiddler playing something warm and slightly imperfect that sounded exactly right anyway. "Do you remember," she said quietly, not looking away from the room, "the first gathering, the first one I noticed you sitting beside me?" "I remember," he said. "I thought it was coincidence," she said. "I know," he said, "and then the second time I thought it was coincidence." "I know," he said, the same quiet amusement. "And the third time I began to wonder," she said. "And then 6 months later you asked me directly," he said. "And you told me the truth," she said. "I told you the truth," he said. She turned and looked at him then. This man she had sat beside and walked beside and slept beside and worked beside and raised children beside. This man who had been the best and most constant presence of her life for 12 years. And she said the thing she had said many times but meant no less for the repetition of it. "That was the right answer," she said. His hand found hers on the bench between them, and he held it with the steady warmth she had first felt on a cold October night walking home from a gathering where she had finally asked him the question directly, and he said the thing that was, for him, the fullest possible expression of everything. "It was the only answer I had." The fiddler played. Samuel sat straight and read his book. Clara Mee watched the room with her grandmother's eyes for people and her father's eyes for color. Thomas had gotten himself onto Cal Reeves's lap 2 rows ahead, and was apparently explaining something at length to the weathered and patient old ranch hand, who was listening with more attention than most adults would have given a 3-year-old's passionate speech about whatever 3-year-olds found urgently worth saying. Outside, the October plains stretched in all directions under a vast and generously starred sky, and the creek ran dark over its stones, and the cottonwoods had gone gold along its banks, and the settlement that had become a town that had become home stood solid and warm and full of light against the enormous dark of the frontier, having decided, all those years ago, to be exactly what it was. And inside, on the third bench from the front on the left side, a man and a woman sat beside each other with their hands joined in the quiet, easy way of people who have nothing left to be uncertain about, who have asked and answered and built and chosen and kept choosing, who have sat beside each other through every kind of weather and found, every time, that the place they wanted to be was exactly where they were.